welcome to DNA. It's been one of my favourite subjects for pretty much all my life, since I found out about it as a pre-teen, reading books from the Time Life series. So, what is DNA? We're going to go all the way into looking at this. So, the question, what is DNA? DNA is the genetic code, which is literally a code for the construction of life forms. So every single life form on Earth contains a code, which is how everything gets constructed, whether it's a tree or a whale or you or me. Whatever life form it is, this is the code that does it, so they're going to look and find out exactly what that code is and how it works. So the big breakthroughs that happened to me in my life about DNA was in 2001. And my first experience was with two plants, the mimosa and the hamala. And in my experience with those plants, I was suddenly given this information, and it was literally the plants were whispering into my ear. And what they said is, you do know that with us you can reprogram your DNA, don't you? I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about at the time, unsurprisingly. Second thing that happened to me in the same year was an experience with the mushrooms, the tiny little psilocybin mushrooms, and this is what these did. They showed me what DNA actually looks like, and it was a very big surprise in the best possible way. So what I need to do now is to show you an image of how I was taught to understand DNA. So this goes back to when I was researching it privately when I was a preteen. That is the classic image which science portrays DNA to be. Now, what I saw when the mushroom showed me DNA was its exact opposite. So rather than there being a black background and there being a static stick model representation of DNA, what I saw suddenly was light and movement and form. So DNA for me is very active, very mobile, and it's all about light, really bright light. So that was a fundamental paradigm shift in my perception of DNA. So the next thing I'm going to talk to you about is as follows. Here's a way to understand how DNA works, this genetic code for the instruction to create a life form. This is how it works. Right now you're looking at a screen, and so am I. So what happens is I look at the camera and I share with you, and the information in words and pictures gets converted into a series of zeros and ones. It's so easy to forget this about computers, isn't it? That's what it is. Every single bit of information, visually, auditory, gets converted into a whole series of zeros and ones, including combinations of zeros and ones which actually say to start a piece for information transmission and then to stop. Now you'll find that's very significant as we go on. So what I'm saying is, what I'm doing gets converted into zeros and ones, the computer processes, the internet transmits it, your device processes it, and the next thing you know, you are perceiving me speaking, and you can see me. All this is zeros and ones. So this communication is literally coded into two forms of existence, 0 and 1, on or off. Now look what you can do with that. So many things can be done with that information. You can find out about vaccines, you can look at pornography, you can listen to music, you can watch films, the list goes on. You can get instructions for how to do something. Almost infinite amount of things can be done simply through the transmission of zeros and ones. So that's how it works with computers. Now, how about life forms? Well, there is an incredible similarity, which is why I'm using the model for you. So rather than the code being zeros and ones, the code is in fact consisting of what we call 4 base pairs: adenine, guanine, cytosine and thymine. So already you can notice something incredibly exciting, because if you can do all that we can do with just zeros and ones, imagine what's possible with 4 possibilities, which is actually what we've got going on to create life. And so DNA is literally deoxyribose nucleic acid. And let's face it, that doesn't mean a thing, does it? No, of course it doesn't. It's just a big mouthful of words. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you all the way down the rabbit hole so you can understand how this works. And the first thing you need to understand is that all matter, all material things, whether apparently living or non-living, is composed of what we call atoms. And these atoms themselves are composed of subatomic particles. So we're going to go and look into this in a considerable amount of detail so you can understand exactly what DNA actually is. So here we go. DNA, like all matter, is made up of atoms. So that begs the obvious question, what's an atom? So an atom is as follows. Atoms are composed of subatomic particles. And here's the first one. This is called a proton. So the thing about the proton, as you can obviously see, is it's positively charged. That's what the plus represents. And I'm going to draw you this, which represents an electron. So the proton's in red, the electron is in blue. And I'm going to give an example of the simplest construction of an atom that we know about. And this is an atom of hydrogen. So what happens is you've got the proton in the centre, and orbiting the proton you have this electron. So the electron is whizzing around the outside very, very fast indeed, and the proton is in the centre. So this is an example of an atom of hydrogen. Hydrogen is the lightest gas known, and it's a highly inflammable gas, so when people made airships and filled them with hydrogen, the slightest spark would cause the whole thing to explode. So notice the symmetry. One proton, one electron, that gives you hydrogen. Now, if I was to simply add one more subatomic particle, which I'm going to do now, and this one is called a neutron. So here's the obvious thing. Proton positively charged, electron negatively charged. The neutron has got no charge, but it does have mass. So what happens when we add a neutron? It's no longer hydrogen, we've changed it to a completely different gas. This gas is called helium. Helium does not catch fire and explode. What helium does is if you inhale it, you sound like Mickey Mouse when you start speaking. Completely different gas, completely different properties. The only thing that's at all similar between the two is they're both lighter than air, so they can be both used for making balloons rise. So this is what an atom is. An atom is simply a combination of protons and electrons with or without neutrons. So in order to understand this a bit more, what scientists have done is they've created something called the periodic table of the elements. And so the very first atom on that periodic table is the one which is hydrogen, which I've mentioned earlier, so it's given the name H. And you add that, then it becomes helium, so it goes hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, and it goes on, and there are well over 100 of these elements. So this is what an element is. An element is a combination of protons, neutrons and electrons which create an atom of a particular quality. So I said that hydrogen is a gas which explodes and catches fire easily. Helium, when you inhale it, makes you sound like Mickey Mouse. Lithium is actually used for bipolar disorder. So what an incredible diversity we're beginning to discover. However, I'm going to cut to the chase. The thing that matters for us to understand is what I'm going to call the components of an organic molecule, because that's what we're heading towards. And the components are as follows. Hydrogen, which we've already mentioned, carbon, which I'm going to go for next, and then nitrogen, and then oxygen. Hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen are the main building blocks of all organic life, all materials that include organic life. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take you through the process. So now I'm showing you what an atom of carbon looks like. So we've got 6 protons in the centre, and the centre is called a nucleus, and then we also have 6 neutrons, which, as you remember, have no charge at all. And then finally, whizzing around the outside, electrons, 6 of them. And so people refer to carbon as being carbon 12 because there's 6 protons and 6 neutrons in what we now call, this is named the nucleus. So what you've got is you've got the nucleus of the atom, positively charged, and you've got these electrons whizzing around the outside. So what scientists discovered is that atoms of hydrogen didn't exist on their own. And what would actually happen, you'd have one atom of hydrogen with 1 proton and 1 electron would get together with another atom of hydrogen with a proton and electron, and they would form this bond, this connection between the two. And that's why when people write hydrogen, they write H2, because it's 2 atoms bonded together. And this is the most important thing to understand how DNA works, is because of what we call the ability of atoms to bond. So here's another example where atoms can bond, and that's with oxygen. So you've got a couple of oxygen atoms here, and what happens is they come together, and here is the bond that joins them together. So when we think about oxygen, the chemical formula, we write O2. Similar story. So atoms can get together in pairs of identical ones, that's a possibility, or different atoms can come together. So here's one of the most famous chemical formulae in the world: 2 atoms of hydrogen joining together with an atom of oxygen and bonding. And when they bond, that creates water. And this is the way that it all works. So what we see is we see bonds between atoms, which literally creates molecules. So we have gone from an atom to a molecule. So a molecule is simply a conglomeration or a collection of atoms together. And we're looking at some really simple ones here. So science, being simple, has come up with some simple ways of describing things. So an atom of hydrogen is simply shown with the H. And what we can see is the hydrogen is capable of having a single bond, which is that vertical line beneath it. Carbon, on the other hand, is much more versatile. Of course, it's got more subatomic particles in its construction. Remember, 6 protons and 6 neutrons. So this can actually create 4 bonds. So it can bond with 4 different atoms at the same time. Oxygen can bond with 2 different atoms, and nitrogen can bond with 3. So just to give an example of how this could work, let's supposing we have got carbon and hydrogen getting together. Well, this is what could happen. You could have a double bond between the 2 carbons, and then they've still got space left over for a couple of extras, so they can actually bond to a couple of atoms of hydrogen each. So that carbon there has got 2 bonds and bonds with those 2 hydrogens. That carbon there has got 2 bonds and bonds those 2 hydrogens, and that creates a gas called ethylene, which you can set fire to, and it produces carbon dioxide and water in the flame. And the other thing about it, it's used for ripening fruit, especially bananas in tankers that get transported long distances. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at the molecule which is called ribose. Now this is the main step that we're going to take. So here's ribose, and it makes something called RNA. So what we got, let's have a look. We can see we've got carbon atoms, and they've got double bonds joining up along there. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, joining them all up. And interestingly enough, it turns out that the number 1 and the number 4 are connected by an oxygen, which gives you this particular shape. And then at each carbon, the extra 2 bonds are used up by either bonding to a hydrogen or to an oxygen, which is then bonded to another hydrogen. And that OH is called a hydroxyl group. It's simply an oxygen and a hydrogen joined together, in this case bonded onto that carbon. And you can see, so you've got a hydroxyl group and a hydrogen group, and then the other way round, and then that same way round. And over here we've got something a bit more complicated. We've got a hydrogen atom, And over here we've got another carbon atom with two hydrogens over there, and a hydroxyl group, an oxygen and a hydrogen there. And that's ribose, which is the main building block to create RNA. Now, I haven't said anything about RNA yet, and I want to just wait before I do, because the main focus of all this work that we're doing today is to understand DNA. So there's ribose. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take us across to the next one, and we can see deoxyribose, and here is deoxyribose. Now, the first thing you might say, well, it looks pretty much the same as the last one. In fact, I'll just flip back. There we go. And flip on. And the clue is the little red dots, because the only difference between these two molecules is the fact that in ribose, you've got a hydroxyl group on the second carbon atom, and on deoxyribose, one of the oxygens is missing, and that's why it's called deoxy. Deoxy simply means -1 oxygen. So this is the really all-important molecule, which is one of the main building blocks to make DNA itself. So what you need to understand about DNA is a very long chain, and I'll give you a little picture there. So it's a twisted double helix, it's a long chain composed of all sorts of atoms. So what we're going to do now, we're going to take it further. So this deoxyribose is actually joined onto what we've got here. So there's the deoxyribose in the centre of the picture, and over on the top left hand side we've got something called the phosphate group. Now a phosphate group is just a phosphorus atom with a single bond of an oxygen, single bond of an oxygen, but a double bond to that oxygen and a single bond to that oxygen. So that is actually what a phosphate group is, and it's just joined on to that end of the deoxyribose. So it's got that on it, on that end, on the carbon number 5, and all the way on the carbon number 1 it's got what we call one of the 4 bases, and the 4 bases are adenine, guanine, cytosine or thymine. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us even further along to this one. So we've got a phosphate group, we've got a deoxyribose group, another phosphate group, another deoxyribose group, and so it goes on, another phosphate group. So this is the beginnings of being able to see the long chain. Now, this is literally the helix, the twisted helix that we're used to. This is literally one strand of the twisted helix, and every time you've got a ribose group, a deoxyribose group, it's joined onto a base, and there's 4 possibilities: adenine, guanine, cytosine and thymine. So now I'm going to take you finally to this picture, which shows you the whole thing. So that's it. So on the far left hand side, what you've got is you've got one DNA strand, phosphate group, deoxyribose, phosphate group, deoxyribose, phosphate group, and all the way along. And just to give you this particular example, this base pair, this base that it's joined to is called thymine, and this one is joined to cytosine on this strand. And then we look at the other one. This is the other strands. Now the really interesting thing to notice about this other strand is it's the other way around, and this is something that shamans taught a very long time ago, and it's a very simple but interesting description I'm going to go into in a minute. So on the left, the deoxyribose is facing that way around. On this side they're facing the opposite way around. So you are looking at a tiny little bit of a DNA twisted double helix. This is actually the full molecular structure of what's going on. So notice that the 2 strands are made of these phosphate groups on the deoxyriboses, and every deoxyribose is attached to a base, and these 2 bases are joined together, so I'm going to show you them. So there's thymine. So what is thymine? Let's just have a look there. So thymine is a carbon atom, 2 bonds, a carbon atom, single bond, carbon. Then there's a nitrogen, then a single bond and a carbon, and a single bond and a nitrogen, and a single bond back to carbon. And this creates a ring. So it's got a ring structure, and then stuck on the end of it, there's a hydrogen there, there's a carbon with 3 hydrogens there, a double bond and an oxygen, and a very interesting bond that I'm showing in the dotted line there. Here we've got a nitrogen, a hydrogen, and a very interesting bond here. And that is basically what thymine is. Now, what is it joined onto? It is joined onto, it's bonded to this adenine. Now, the adenine is pretty similar in structure to the thymine, but it's a little bit simpler. So if you go back, see there's that one. See what that looks like? And this one. So they're not identical, but here's the all-important bit. The all-important bit is that these 2 bases are joined together by bonds. And I've drawn them as a dotted line just because I'm doing my best to show you how they're connected, and there are limitations of getting this thing onto paper. So if I go back to this drawing here, this is another way to show it. So I'm using colour coding. So if the thymine is the blue, then that would mean the adenine is the red, which would then mean the cytosine would be yellow and the guanine would be green. So what I want you to notice is that these bases are close together and they are bonded, as well as being bonded to the actual DNA strand itself. So if we go back to it again, this is what DNA is. It's a combination of atoms of hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So the entire DNA, twisted double helix, is only composed of those 5 atoms, all organized and arranged and bonded together in this very particular way. Everything that's alive, all living beings, are made of DNA. So there's a human hand, and I'm just looking at a tiny fragment of that human hand. And what I would notice is that that human hand, like all the rest of us, is made of cells. And here's the thing that's really quite something to get your head around, because there are billions of cells in one human being. Yeah, actually billions. It's a mathematical number. It's so big it's hard to conceive of what billions are. And every cell is made up of a cell membrane, which is double, which is why I've shown it in that way. And then there's what we call cytoplasm, which contains the mitochondria, which are the energy-producing powerhouse of the cell, all the biochemical processes, everything that the cell requires to make the cell work is in there, except for this bit here. This has got a double membrane around it, and this is what we call the nucleus. And the nucleus is where the DNA is. So all the DNA is inside the nucleus of all the cells in your body, with one exception I can think of, and that's your red blood cells. Your red blood cells don't have any nuclei, they have no DNA, and they only last 4 months, and then they are replaced. But all other cells in the human body are made up like this. Now here's the thing. DNA emits virtual photons. In other words, that's right, DNA produces light, inevitably and automatically, and the cell membranes, these 2 cell membranes around your cell, produce virtual photons too. So when you go and have your photograph taken of a part of your body with a Kirlian camera, what it shows is this light emanating from the tissue of the human being or the plant or whatever it might happen to be. So that's right, we are light beings, that's what we are. So if we were to focus in on that DNA in some more detail, that would take us to this image here. And there we see that twisted double helix that we saw earlier. And we can see the base pairs in their colours, all joined together. And this is the nearest I can get to show you what DNA looks like using static models. And the little flecks all the way around it is to show you that it's light, it's vibrant. This is actually what it is. It is light and it's alive. And then all the way at this end, what I've done is I've started to show you something very significant, because what's happening here is a twisted double helix is opening up. And that opening up needs to happen to actually create a life form, because what happens is when that life form is created, the instructions which are housed in the genetic code there, the DNA unwinds, and what comes into the picture is something called RNA. And what RNA does is it matches up with the open DNA double helix. So what I'm doing now is I'm drawing out the same drawing that I had on the wall there. And I've got my red and blue for the base pairs of thymine and adenine, and I've got my green and my yellow for the base pairs cytosine and guanine. Now, so there all the bases are, and remember they're all paired up, they're all bonded together to create these base pairs. So what's happening here is that the DNA twisted double helix is literally unwinding, and that's preparing itself to receive the RNA. So the RNA comes into the picture. Now RNA is the same as DNA except that it's a single helix. So the DNA is a double twisted helix, this RNA is a single helix. So I'm just working on the part of the DNA that's opening up and putting in the appropriate base pairs. So every time there's a blue on one side, I'm putting a red, and vice versa. Same as the yellows and the greens. Right, so that's your adenine, your guanine, your cytosine, your thymine base pairs all put in there. So this is what I'm showing you. So what happens is the RNA comes in as a single strand. Remember, the DNA is a double strand, that the RNA comes in as a single strand, and its job is to transcribe this information, and this is how it does it. So it's got its own base pair sequence, and what it does is it creates a base pair sequence to match the DNA that it's transcribing. So here it goes. So there's a guanine there, so it's going to be matched up with a cytosine. Same thing's going to happen there and there. And then there's a thymine, is going to be matched up with an adenine. So thymines are these red ones, so they're going to be matched up with the adenine. This is all exactly the same as what we saw before, until we get to this point here, because these adenines are actually going to get matched up. You'd expect them to get matched up with a thymine, wouldn't you? Makes sense, but actually this is the unique difference about the RNA. It doesn't have any thymine, it's got uracil, so where you'd expect to see thymine, you get uracil. So this is how the instruction, the code, is transcribed from the DNA to the RNA. The RNA then goes away into the cytoplasm of the cell, to the ribosomes, and actually does the job of making whatever it is that the cell requires to make. Whether that's creating some new components in the cell or a brand new cell, in the case of cell division. That's when cells replicate themselves and they produce copies of themselves. So this is the process, and in case you're wondering, yeah, the same thing would happen. Another strand of RNA would come along here, and its base pairs would line up in the same way to match what's going on that side. So both helixes would get transcribed in this process. So that was a pretty heavy scientific look at the details of the molecular biology of DNA. So let's take it all the way back to shamanism and to indigenous societies and people's understanding. It goes back over 40,000 years. Well, it just so happens that this shape that we spent so much time looking at, the transcription of DNA, is actually seen by shamans and other indigenous people, and the way that they've drawn this is in this classic shape of the serpent with two heads. And you can even notice the striping effect, which relates very much to the DNA structure. So it turns out that what science has been beavering away studying at for the last 60 or so years is actually something that's very, very well known the world over in traditional cultures. So we have this understanding that there is this code or blueprint within us which has got this very particular way of operating. And again, it's a matter of the DNA helix is unwinding and the base pairs being copied by the RNA. That's what that image of the double-headed serpent is showing. And to me this is incredibly exciting, because this is what we've got going on. This process of transcription, this process by which the information from the code of the DNA actually gets turned into a new life form, such as when two people have sex and procreate a child, or a plant produces a cutting of itself, or a fruit is created. All these processes are all the result of this transcription, this copying of the information from the DNA to the RNA. Now this is a bit that is really mind-blowing to me. Every single life form that has ever been studied has the DNA transcription process exactly identical. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about a whale or a human being, or a frog, or a spider, or a blade of grass, or a tree. All life forms transcribe the code for their construction in exactly the same way. And this starts to seem to be way beyond coincidence as far as many people are concerned. Because when we think about studying different aspects of different life forms, for example, people do research on rats and other animals to try to get some understanding about how the medical aspects of the human body work, and they keep on always giving us the rider, well, we did this experiment on rats, we don't know whether that means that it's going to work the same way for humans. And that's true of almost all processes. We don't know if they're going to be the same. They may or they may not be. And yet when it comes to DNA transcription, it's identical for all life forms. And this is what was so amazing, is they realised that only 3% of the DNA is used to construct the entire human being. That's right. 97% of all the DNA in each of the billions of cells in your bodies got labelled by biologists as junk DNA. I know that beggars the imagination, but it shows how the materialist mindset is so limited. So that's right. 97% of your DNA is regarded by biologists to be junk DNA. And yet, my suggestion is it's something very different. And we will go in to look at that in detail. But before we do, I want to bring us back to this thing I said about the computer binary, zeros and ones, that this entire film is simply coded into zeros and ones. And I did mention that at the beginning and at the end of each little bit of information, remember we talk about bits and bytes in computers, well, each bit has got a start code and a stop code. Exactly the same thing with the DNA. So those series of A, C, Gs and Ts also in a certain sequence indicate start transmit information and stop transmit information. So all the information to code you in your entirety, plus all the starters and the stops, only takes up 3% of your entire DNA complement, and there's 97% that's doing something else. So it's time to refer you to this extraordinary book, The Cosmic Serpent, by Jeremy Narby. If this subject interests you, it's certainly worth studying. And I'm going to draw your attention particularly to page 90 and what it has to say. So here we go. DNA is the informational molecule of life, and its very essence consists of being both single and double, like these mythical serpents. And DNA and its duplication mechanisms are the same for all living creatures. The only thing that changes from one species to another is the order of the letters, A, C, G or T. This constancy goes back to the very origins of life on Earth. According to the biologist Robert Pollack, the planet's surface has changed many times over, but DNA and the cellular machinery for its replication have remained constant. Such an amazing thing. And now from page 92. DNA is the master of transformation, like the mythical serpents. The cell-based life DNA informs made the air we breathe, the landscape we see, and the mind-boggling diversity of living beings of which we are a part. In 4 billion years it's multiplied itself into an incalculable number of species while remaining exactly the same. Inside the nucleus, DNA coils and uncoils, it writhes and it wriggles. Scientists often compare the form and the movements of this long molecule to those of a snake. Molecular biologist Christopher Wills writes, "The two chains of DNA resemble two snakes coiled around each other in some elaborate courtship ritual." To sum it all up, DNA is a snake-shaped master of transformation that lives in water and is both extremely long and small, single and double, just like the Cosmic Serpent. So what I want to draw your attention to is this bit. DNA lives in water. One of the most important things we can do for our health is to drink plenty of good quality water. If your body is well hydrated, your DNA is working well and at greatest efficiency. If you are dehydrated, this is affecting your DNA in a profoundly unhelpful manner, and it's going to become sluggish and it's going to have less life and less movement. The other very extraordinary piece of information is it seems from the research that tobacco is another substance which activates the DNA. So to activate our DNA, there is water, and that's a must for all of us. And there's also the possibility of working with tobacco too. Which brings me to the whole subject of working with plants. So when I did a lot of researches into the green medicine back in 2014, a series of 5-day retreats personally for several months. And here are some images to show you. So here's the first image, and this is literally going into the green medicine, and there's a bridge opening up before me and the portal key shaped to which I entered. And then in the medicine I was shown this image, and this is perhaps the most powerful image I've done with the green medicine, which shows you again the idea of the serpent and the mouth of the serpent opening up for the transcription process, and you can see the DNA strands within it. So the green medicine really helped me to understand more about what's going on. And then what I want to do is to give you the old science model and then the new science model, because this is also very important to grasp. Old science says that your DNA is a fixed quantity, immutable and changeless. In fact, it implies it's not capable of change. And so this is the reason that they say that a person is likely to get a disease if an ancestor had that disease, because they're saying that you're going to be copying and patterning upon your ancestors, which to a certain extent is true. Only the big breakthrough came with Russian scientists in 1987, because they saw that rather than DNA being a fixed quantity, it's exactly the opposite. It's open to change and highly influenced by everything in our lives. So our environment affects our DNA. Those that we come into contact with affect our DNA. Your DNA is always becoming more active if you're doing things which help, like hydrate yourself, or becoming less active if you are in a state of chronic dehydration. And so this takes us even further, and we now know, again thanks to the Russian scientists, that we can program our DNA through commands. And this brought about the work that was done by a woman called Kishori Aird, who wrote a book about DNA activation. And in my own shamanic work, based upon that work and combining with the universal soul retrieval practice, it suddenly became part of the work to work on the client's DNA. And the way that it works, in the USR, the DNA base pair sequences which have been corrupted through pollution or negative environments are then restored in line with your optimal human template as decided by your higher self. So any client that has the DNA work done, all the work is done exactly in accordance with the instructions from that individual's higher self, and that's very important that that model is followed. Biologists realised that 97% of DNA didn't actually code for the life form at all, but had some mysterious function that they decided wasn't relevant, so they decided to call it junk DNA. Pretty amazing statement. So what about that 97%? What is it doing? And there's difference of opinion on this, as you'd expect. So you've got Jeremy Narby with his Cosmic Serpent, and particularly the information from the guy Michael Harner, who is one of the primary academics that brought shamanism to the West, which is that it's a alien life form, and that we are all life forms on this planet are simply a means by which this alien life form is disguised. Well, bearing in mind what I mentioned about chaos magic, that's an interesting thought form to inhabit for a while, see how it feels, the idea that maybe every single life form on this planet actually is a cover for another form of existence. And could that be what people are praying to when they talk about the source, or whatever word they use to like to describe the supreme being? Is that what they're on about? Or let's go to a completely different take. Let's go to someone like Chris Thomas, who's been practicing as a healer for 35 years plus now, and has access to the Akashic record, which is the record of all information which has taken place of all events which have taken place on this planet since the beginning. And he puts it this way. He says that so-called junk DNA is actually the storage of all the memories of all the other existences that we've had apart from the one that we're living right now. So the current lifetime and your current incarnation, that's the 3% of your DNA. The 97% is all the other existences which you have. So there's an interesting other way of looking at it. So you can put that one on as a mind set belief system, see how that feels. However, what is in no doubt is that 97% of our DNA does something other than code for our existence. That's pretty significant. And all the way through this, pretty much, I've been referring to things from what I would call the Western mindset, the rational scientific viewpoint of seeing life forms as composed of these two strands, these twisted strands of the Oxyribose nucleic acid, DNA, and it's time to break out of that narrow confine. And I link back with what I mentioned about Kishori Aird earlier, because when we look at the bigger picture, we find that there are a total of 13 helices for each life form, not 2. So the 2 helices, they're the ones that we're aware of at the moment in Western science, and there is all these other helices of DNA which actually are in the process of becoming manifested into the physical realms. So they've always been there. It's just that in the process of us becoming more who we truly are, these helices are becoming manifested, and it explains certain of the children and young people who have very special powers, and this is dealt with in the mainstream by films such as the X-Men, only they're just really a pale reflection of what's actually going on. So if you do research, you'll find there are human beings, mostly young people, who have got really pretty amazing powers, something you can research. Now, here's what amazes me most of all about DNA. is the fact that every life form that we know about, every plant, every tree, every blade of grass, every crowing cockerel, every dog, every cat, every bird, anteaters, lions, you name it, all life forms have exactly the identically same process for the DNA transcription. And remember, DNA transcription is simply the process by which the code in the DNA gets converted into instructions to make life. So the way that you're constructed from your DNA, the way a bird is, the way a whale is, the way the tree is, the way the blade of grass is, all completely identical. Now when you think about that, that really is extraordinary. That's the situation, and that is perhaps one of the greatest mysteries. We know when scientists do experiments and they studying, say, something like cancer or drug addiction or whatever it might happen to be, and they're using rats, and people always say, oh yeah, that might be true for that species, but it's not true for all species. Well, this is the thing that is true for all species. All species have exactly the same method for the DNA code to be turned into that life form. It's really something to ponder.
Amam besigan